House is full, 106, 59, 58 people already. So that actually reflects how popular our speaker is.
Definitely. Nasir, ready?
Okay, so now we can start now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Ina Siddiqui, and I, along with my colleague, Ms. Khazima Muazzam at COMSTECH Islamabad, welcome you all in one of the most popular program being conducted by COMSTECH. This is COMSTECH Distinguished Speaker Webinar Series. Lots of eminent speakers from almost all areas of science and technology have spoke at this forum, and today is the 17th webinar of its kind, and we are very fortunate to have another very eminent speaker with us. With this, I would like to invite Coordinator Journal, His Excellency Professor Dr. Mohammad Iqbal Chaudhry, my very dear teacher, to introduce us with today's speaker. Sir, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning and good afternoon in different time zones. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Brother Hassan Masood, who is not only a very dear friend, but also someone of a personality inspire everyone. He has done wonderful work in his field and has recognition internationally on his achievements in the field of science journalism. We have seen in the context of pandemic, when the humanity was trying to meet the challenges which pandemic has posed, there were many things actually happened, and there were many aspects of development as well as human relationship which has exposed the vulnerability of humanity at large. For instance, we have seen gross failure of international cooperation. We have seen governance, how important governance is in different countries. We have seen the countries which were able to invest in health and nutrition and primary care were able to cope this health challenge much better way than many other countries. At the same time, I think one of the greatest challenges which we all have faced in last year was fake news. We have not really seen. We have seen a great challenge. People struggling everywhere to communicate right information and knowledge to the people. And I don't know, at maybe some point of time, people would take an account of how much damage this miscommunication has caused to humanity during this pandemic because of lack of communication in science communication, and also, our ability to reach out to masses. But certainly, it was a major colossal failure in terms of communication. And this has created a niche and importance that science communication should really get importance. Not only communicating science in its best to the people, not only that creating a constituency of science in general public, but also to meet the challenges of this magnitude. And for this purpose, we have someone of the stature of Hassan Masood. Hassan Masood is a person of excellence. He has done amazing work throughout these decades and has contributed immensely in developing understanding of science and technology in the developing world, and also mapping and developing this linkages between science and society. Let me introduce Hassan Masood. He's a science journalist by profession, a very well-read person. He's presently Nature's editor for editorial and also has responsibility for journals news coverage from Africa and Middle East. So these are the areas, apart from a lot of other important aspects of science journalism which he handles, his in-depth understanding of Africa, Middle East, South Asia, praiseworthy. He is the author of a number of books, including The Great Invention, a narrative of history of how GDP became the world's most influential economic indicator. Uh, he has also written extensively on science and Islam history. This is also one of his very famous books. He has also made documentaries on the science and policy for BBC, Radio 4, and was 2017-2018 Knight Science Journalism Fellow at the MIT. Between 2007 and 17, he taught science and innovation policy to students of science communication at Imperial College London. Ehsan is a great friend of COMSTECH. He has been working with COMSTECH on many projects since long. He has contributed immensely in developing understanding of science journalism in YC world, and I'm sure that Ehsan's contribution would go a long way. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Ehsan Masood for his presentation on pandemic lessons for science communication. Over to you, Ehsan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Hina. Thank you, Professor Iqbal, for this kind invitation to talk about science communication in the context of the pandemic. I have a prepared text which I'll just speak or read out to you for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to make essentially three main points in this, and then what I'd really appreciate is, we have a great audience here, and I'm sure there are many of you here with your own experiences of science communication, whether it's communication between researchers, whether it's between researchers and the wider public, whether it's between researchers and policymakers. So I think it'd be great to have a good discussion about this. But I will begin my remarks now, and then we can go into more of a discussion. So it is looking as if the coronavirus pandemic is on its way, sadly, tragically, to it will take perhaps nearly 2 million lives, maybe more. We know so much more about it in these past 12 months. It overwhelmingly is killing older people, especially those with pre-existing medical conditions. It's targeting the poorest, people who are homeless, people who live in communal settings, particularly like prisons. It's thriving in places where it's difficult, if not impossible, to implement the necessary social distancing, the mask wearing, the hand hygiene that can be the difference between life and death. And it's precipitated probably the most severe global economic downturn for at least a century, and quite honestly, longer. Lockdowns, especially in the poorest countries, are having devastating consequences to lives and to livelihoods. And just one example, India's first lockdown, led to one of the largest, if not the largest, mass migration this country's seen in modern times, with 150 people newly unemployed having to leave cities and return to their towns and villages. And this has been seen in many, many places. And so, of course, as with the pandemics in history, the 20th century pandemics that we know of, one of which the 1918 pandemic, which killed, by some estimates, around 50 million people and had about 500 million infections. The 2020 coronavirus pandemic of COVID-19, we know will have longer lasting effects. It's going to change the balance of power between nations. I think that's pretty evident, that's pretty clear. It's going to affect, at least in the short term, just our very basic things like where we travel, how often we travel, where we go, how long we stay. And then it's going to make some quite telling changes to science. It's going to change, to some extent, how science is done. It is already changing, at least in the context now, how medicines and vaccines are approved by regulatory bodies. And then it's going to change, and is changing, how science is communicated. And this is the third point that I'm going to just dwell on for the next 10 or 15 minutes. So just to kind of, it almost feels like an age, but if I take myself back to a year from now, almost a year to the week, I can remember sitting at my desk in our offices at Nature in London, and it was a few weeks after the first reports of this mysterious unknown virus that had started to filter out of Wuhan in China. This was around the middle of January, middle to late January 2020, and the media were reporting initially about 100 cases, then it became 200, and then it became 300 cases. And the overwhelming majority were in Wuhan, but cases were also being reported in Japan, in South Korea, and in Thailand. And then by the third week of January, we heard that 6 people had died. We weren't sure entirely whether the virus could transmit between humans. Human-to-human transmission at that stage hadn't been confirmed. The first cases had been traced to a live animal market, and we had known by that stage that the virus was one of the SARS viruses, likely infected to humans via bats. And then around the middle of January, and I still remember this, researchers from a laboratory at Imperial College, they did some quick modeling of people going in and out of Wuhan. And they found that there weren't 300 infections, as we had thought, but there were in fact an estimated 1,700. Now, looking at it now, it just feels so completely trivial because we've got more than 90 million infections globally. But to the untrained eye, and that was me, that was most of us who are not epidemiologists or not virologists, 1,700 was like a 6 times multiple. And I remember it just didn't feel believable. I felt, I don't believe this, like it's supposed to be 300. How can it be, what is this modeling that says it's 1,700? But of course, we now know that it's so much more worse. And then the other slightly alarming prospect was that within days, the countries of East Asia were preparing for the New Year Spring Festival. And if this modeling was even remotely correct, it meant that potentially hundreds of millions of people would be traveling for their holidays, to be with their family and their friends in that time. And of course, that could become a much more serious or dangerous situation. So very quickly, what we found, or what I certainly learned, amongst other things, was that this very fast piece of research, not published in the usual way, produced by a very credible team, communicated directly to the public, accessible to the world, was suddenly making an impact on my behavior, on policy, and in many other ways. And I think it was a sort of almost like a little talisman that this may be the shape of things to come, of much more rapid science communication, much more quickly done, and much more quicker science as well, of course, as we know. And in a way, we could argue that, well, the pandemic has closed down many of the usual ways in which we congregate as researchers. We're not going to our scientific conferences, our academies are closed, we're not having meetings, and we're meeting in this way, like through Zoom, but it's, it has its great benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. Many of our labs are shut. And so the idea that communication can be done in this sort of really speedy way through effectively the medium of university-based reports, through preprints, of course, it allows many more people to become involved, both lay and expert, in the process of research and research communication. But of course, it also has its downsides. So that's kind of one big point that I just wanted to make, is that the pandemic has really accelerated the ability of the researcher, of all of you, to reach your audiences so much more quickly. And we're a receptive audience. We are waiting. There's a lot of hunger out there for scientific information and for research-based knowledge, especially. And I just wanted to really just expand on that a little bit, because one of the defining features of this pandemic has been the extent to which countries are acting alone. And maybe a different incumbent in the White House, in the American presidency, might have made a bit of a difference. But honestly, it is really quite astonishing how little high-level cooperation there has been some basic questions like, what are the criteria for lockdowns? What is appropriate social distancing and when? When do you open and close borders? How do you test, trace, and isolate? This is not advanced technology. It should have been possible to arrive at some kind of consensus amongst the world, really. But all of these things have been happening according to countries' own standards. Everyone is, with some exceptions, but mostly people are doing it by themselves. This is very much a pandemic of, I don't know, I could call it pandemic of selfishness. But the contrast with science for me, has been really fascinating. It's not like we don't have competitive behavior in research. Of course we do. It's one of the most competitive domains. But the pandemic has shown that when researchers can set aside that need or that desire to compete, and when we put down and agree to work towards a greater shared goal, then look what can happen. And as Professor Iqbal was saying, I've been in science journalism, well, this will be now 25 years, and I just simply haven't seen this level of cooperation. It's been a little bit like a relay race for those of you who watch the Olympics. Within the first days of the first cases, the researchers from China published the first genome sequences, and that was essential. It's completely essential, because that then helped us to get to testing kits quickly, which was the work of many public health bodies. The genome sequence then allowed structural biologists to do their work they needed to do in protein structures. That work was then very quickly taken up by the pharmaceutical industry in the task of beginning to design vaccine candidates. All of this was happening in the first weeks. And then, of course, people on my side of the aisle, if you like, in science publishing, we've all been working pretty much around the clock across time zones to review and publish, the absolute mountain of papers that are coming our way. And so that's in a way a really positive development, in that the way in which we as researchers communicate amongst each other, has been a much more collegial, a much more cooperative endeavor, in contrast to the things that are happening at a sort of more higher level. And really, my sort of final point that I just wanted to raise was, again, one that Professor Iqbal also mentioned. And this is what Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization is calling the infodemic, a pandemic of misinformation, but also a pandemic of disinformation, which is deliberate misinformation that's deliberately intended to mislead or potentially to cause harm. It's undoubtedly the case that the flow of scientific information has relied very heavily on social media. We have all benefited massively from social media, and Twitter, especially in my own domain, is critical in conveying ideas quickly. You get a sense, if you follow the right people, of what are the contours of opinion around something new, or just simply alerting people, hey, there's a new paper on this, or there's some new findings. But of course, this ability to communicate so much more quickly and so much more easily with very vast numbers of people, as we know, has downsides. It's fueling the infodemic, and that will have consequences, and that is obviously concerning. This is, of course, not new. Throughout recorded history, there have been many instances of misleading information going viral, and there'll be many of you on this call who will know much more about this. The concerning aspect, of course, is the scale of it and the speed. That really, new technology has literally put rocket boosters under ideas that are less tested, or that are more controversial, or that might be not representative of the consensus opinion. And it allows, and the technology allows these ideas to penetrate vastly more people than would have been possible in the past. And it's really early to say certainly from where I'm sitting, what the impacts of this are. And I'm sure there are people who study the sociology of media, especially, but also people who study the social science of technology, which will be in a much better position to explain, or to perhaps project what it means. One thing that we do know, of course, is that this is also fueling vaccine hesitancy. I don't think it's necessarily causing, but it's fueling vaccine hesitancy. And of course, paradoxically, what we're finding through surveys is that vaccine skepticism and vaccine hesitancy is more likely to be found in the developed countries, in those countries which have fewer pre-pandemic memories of what it means to battle an infectious disease. And because perhaps they become complacent about the value of vaccination. Again, this is not my field, I'm not an expert here. But it is a concern. And so in conclusion, science is happening faster. It's being communicated faster. The regulatory process is happening quicker. Many, many more people are now involved in the research process. We talk about citizen science, and we talk about public involvement and public engagement. All of these things have really come into their own in a way, on a scale that's different. But speed is also fueling an infodemic, a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. What does all this mean? I'm sure all of you on this call will be able to help us to understand what the implications are, to make sense of it all. And thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Hina or Iqbal.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for excellent points you just delivered. And now the floor is open for questions. So do we have some questions from the audience?
Hina, would you like to do it through the chat box? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, we can do it from the chat box, or maybe people can directly.
Or people can just raise their hand, yeah?
Yeah.
So we've got a question that's just come in, which is how to stop the info pandemic. This is from Saeed Assad. How to stop the info pandemic. I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I think I would almost start by saying that the first thing we need to do is to try and understand the extent of the pandemic of misinformation. I think we need some researchers to just get some, what I might call baseline information or baseline data. And so we really understand them. At the moment, I think we're just scratching at the surface, trying to understand, to what extent is it, what is the nature of this pandemic of misinformation, who are the people that are involved, why are people receptive to these messages. I think there's lots and lots of ways in which research can really help. And that's probably where I would start. My starting point would be, let's just get a whole ton of research onto this. And I think that'll help us. Let's have a look. Got another question coming in.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please go right ahead.
Mostly journalists not trained about the science and pandemic and other disease management journalism. So you can any plan to train the scientist as a pandemic and scientific journalism? Any course you design to teach the young scientists to how can convey the message in properly according to the specific manner?
This is a brilliant question. I don't know if you want to just tell us your name. That's a really excellent question. Is it Samia?
Dr. Samia.
Dr. Samia, yes. Dr. Samia, where are you from?
I'm Dr. Samia. I'm PhD in microbiology. This is my subject, but the mostly communication handle the pandemic. No microbiologists on the screen. A lot of confusion, lot of disease management problems. Everyone talk to the own domain. So you can develop the one training, specific training to the scientist, how to communicate the common person and how to discuss the what the manage these pandemic diseases.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, Dr. Samia, and I hope Professor Hina and Professor Iqbal are on the call, because we should pursue this with the organizers. I think this is as good a way. The other way, of course, is to take mainstream journalists who write or cover for television and websites and newspapers, and also to work with them and to develop their own skills, and so they are much more aware of what is science, what is the nature of science, what is the research process, what are the
it
strengths and
is our
limitations.
personal experience in this pandemic. Lot of panic condition created by the journalists, and lot of people die due to the pandemic, because the doctor is also not trained the handle to the pandemic. Lot of news, fake news come, and lot of remedies come in unofficially and in the media and social media through the journalists. To lot, if those journalists have not deep knowledge for these disease and these subject, how can write the essay and news for these pandemic diseases?
I think that's a really excellent question, Samia, and I will and well, we have lots of people here on the call, I'm sure, who can also comment on this, but I think we should somehow try and make this happen. That's a really good idea. Thank you for that.
Sir, I would just like to add in this conversation. I think actually I would like to have your opinion. What do you think? Scientists with the journalism training is more appropriate for this, or journalists with scientific training? Which one is required?
Yeah. Professor Hina, I would say it would be both, honestly, because I think at this stage, as Dr. Samia was saying, that the phenomenon that she's describing is in every village, in every town, every city, every country, and so it's a case of both, having journalists with better science communication understanding and knowledge, and every country has associations of science writers, or many countries do, most countries do perhaps. So that's a vehicle, but at the same time, I think the social media has allowed researchers to go directly to the public, and I think this is a really from where I sit, this is a really welcome development, because I think what it's showing is that some researchers have innately or developed skills, but then they could be the people who could train the trainers, who could have a sort of train the trainer kind of approach. And people who are on all the different channels on LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram and so on, and the other social media channels that now exist. And I think they could be brought in, because in a way, that is now the main way in which all of us we get our information. And for the first time, or certainly rarely, we are now in a situation where before researchers would be much more reluctant, and they would need a lot of, I would remember they'd need a lot of persuading, but that doesn't happen now, and researchers go directly, and I think that's a strength that we could really harness and help in combating misinformation.
I can add one comment also. During this pandemic, we study and we experience the most of journalists show the remedies and treatment of the disease management and test. Basically the rush of people comes into the laboratory, and the high demand of the test and lots of money spent in the unnecessary testing and unnecessary rush. It is a fill the those patient place, those have very serious. Mostly casualties are the rush and panic condition due to the created by the journalist and other media person. So it is a very bad ethically. The medical is a rule of medicine and treatment. No one published any prescription to the social media and journal and other communication. It is a very ethical issues, but it is happening.
I think that's another good point you raised, Samia, which is that the the social media channels, although they have the word media in them, they do not or up till now they've not considered themselves to be media. They classify themselves as being technology platforms, and it means that there's a perception or a belief within these companies, or there has been up till now, that in fact they can that they do not need to conform to the regulatory aspects that apply to media. But I think that will change. In fact, that already is changing, because we're seeing that all of the main tech platforms have policies now, not necessarily ideal or perfect, but they have policies to try and just be a little bit more mindful of the authenticity of the information that's being presented in a way that's always applied to mass media. Mass media in most countries go under those rules. I'm going to look at some other questions. Thank you for that, Samia. It's really appreciated. Let's just look at some other questions that are coming through.
Very dear friend, Maha Lakshmi, she has raised the hand. I think we can have her question first.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Athia. Thank you, Dr. Athia and Dr. Masood for this presentation. I'm a science communicator from Malaysia with a PhD in science communication. Now, my question is, do you think the infodemic is a result of the long-term neglect of science communication by scientists, by government, by universities? Because science communication is not a mainstream profession, it's not a mainstream field in developing countries. And how can we arrest this problem? Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. That's another really great question. I honestly, I'm not in a position to. I can give some thoughts. Science communication is a relatively new field globally. The course that I taught on for many years, but I don't now at Imperial College, is just 25 years old. That's hardly a blink of an eye when it comes to, if you like, the sort of history of ideas or the history of knowledge. It's as a field, it's relatively new. Certainly in the European Union and in lots of countries in the global south. I think it may be a little bit older in the United States, but not that much older. And so, as a field of study and as a field of practice, it's 25 years is there aren't that many fields that I can think of that are still that young or relatively young, and so it's finding its feet. I think it's in its early adulthood, if you like, or late teenage years, and of course it's even younger, as you say, in the countries in the southern hemisphere. It had its own genesis, its own reasons for coming into being, which of course now will be changed with the pandemic. I think the pandemic is going to, I think just the strength of interest, on this call is a really good indication that while we're in the pandemic and once we come out of it, and we will come out of it, a lot of organizations, individuals, countries, universities, science academies are going to be looking at science communication and seeing how can they do better, what can they do different. Does it mean more training? Does it mean more awareness? Training in what? Is it training in technology? Is it training in ideas? Is it training in other things? So I think we are at a moment, a really important moment, where this could be science communication's takeoff point. So yeah, I don't know if that completely answers your question. I think in terms of neglect, I wouldn't necessarily call it neglect, only because it's still a, compared to other fields, even fields that are young fields, it's very, we are very much in the foothills, and we have a way to go. Yeah, and I think the pandemic is that opportunity.
We have another question from Ahmed Musa, our participant. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Prof. Ahmed Musa from Iraq. I need personal opinion. Do you think COVID-19, it is an economical war or political war, or it's a scientific experiment that went out of control? Probably difficult question, but
that's all right. All questions are welcome, Professor Musa. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
From Iraq. I would say that I am completely unqualified to answer those kinds of questions. Not myself being a research scientist. It's not an I mean, all the evidence is that it's definitely not an experiment. It's a real thing, and it's something that the whole world is dealing with. I think it's definitely having economic consequences. We can see that. We can see that from all of the economic data that's coming out of the different agencies that measure economic data. It's having very severe, and of course, even just in terms of people's lives, it's having a huge impact. But no, I just want to sort of emphasize that it is absolutely not an experiment, and there is no evidence there. But it's, as you say yourself, and I'm sure that you're much closer to this than I am, that it's having huge economic consequences.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Thanks.
Very welcome.
Sir, we do have some question in the chat box. If you have some time to.
Yeah, no, I can go into those. So we've got. Let's have a look. Quraysh Khan, as we know, vaccines are coming, but there's speculation that the vaccine is making people lose self-control, and it's causing fear. And what are your thoughts on this? It is true, vaccines are coming, and the vaccines are being developed at a really astonishing speed. I don't think any of us have seen vaccine development at this speed. It's partly because of what I was saying earlier, that all of the researchers have decided that they want to all work together and in tandem, rather like a relay race. Think of the relay race analogy or the relay race metaphor. That's a good way of thinking about this, where the basic biologists have been working with those involved in more applied biology, who in turn are working with people in clinical and translational medicine, who are working with the pharma companies, who are working with their governments, and everyone in this field of vaccines is working in a remarkably coordinated, quite surprisingly coordinated way. That is the reason why there's been so much speed. I think, certainly to my mind, vaccines are the great strength around the world. We, for those of us who, or those of you who follow the history of pandemic illnesses and the history of infectious disease, one of the main ways in which the world has or is eliminating, on the way to eliminating existing infectious diseases, but also some of the ones that are still here, the answer is vaccines. I think we need to do a much better job in working with communities and just helping them to to understand and to appreciate that vaccines will be the difference. At least in the short term, they will be the difference between having a longer pandemic and coming out of this quickly. And of course, I think for at least 1 or 2 more years, it looks like there will be some kind of social distancing still required, and there will be other what are called non-pharmaceutical interventions. But the vaccine, as we know it is the case in so many other infectious diseases, is the way out. Is the way out of this. Dr. Hina, shall we look at some more questions in the chat box?
Yes, we have some time. So if
yep, I've just got a few more minutes. So we've got a question here from Jamila. Knowing the importance of local languages, how can we appreciate science content to write in local language? This Jamila, is a really important question, and I think it also connects to Mahalakshmi's question earlier on as well, which is that if there has been a if you like, a failure or a neglect, I think it is that communicating science in the languages of, that are spoken around the world, pretty much there is a dominance right now of science communication in European languages, particularly in the English language or in French or German. And I think we need to find ways of doing much better and doing really good science communication in national languages too. I think that's completely essential. And I think that has been a neglect, and I think we need to find a way of stopping that. Got a question here from Hassan. Hassan Abbas, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, I am a student of PhD biochemistry from Government College University of Hyderabad. In fact, I am seeing a huge rush in publishing of different aspects of COVID, even though different persons from engineering fields, they are also interested to publish, but novelty is missing. Kindly respond that how can we change this attitude?
I'm sorry, Hassan, can you repeat your question again? I've just got a little bit of a dodgy connection. Can you say that again? Oh, we missed him. Hina, were you there? Were you able to hear that question? Can you repeat it? Hassan, if you can still hear me, why don't you pop it in the chat box, and then I'll know it as well. Oh, here we go. I think I found it. So a lot of Russian journals from writers who are non-relevant experts. That's interesting. That's not something that I've seen myself. How can we change this attitude amongst writers, researchers, and publishers? A lot of Russian journals from writers of non-relevant experts. I think if I understand the question correctly, there are two ways to look at this. One is that it may well be that, in fact, I suspect it probably is, that a lot of researchers, because a lot of research is suspended or delayed, and also because we're in a pandemic, a lot of researchers in allied fields or different fields completely are turning their attention to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I think we're particularly seeing this in anyone with modeling skills, for example. Modeling skills are, as I think as the example that I gave at the very beginning, modeling is certainly one of the really important fields that that is having its moment in the sun in this pandemic, and so I would see that as a positive development, that that there are researchers who are thinking creatively, who are asking questions, and who are asking themselves, I have skill X, how can I apply this to help humanity, to help in dealing with the pandemic, in my local environment, in my local area, in my country. So I think that is I would almost say the other way around, that that's something to be commended and something to be applauded. And I think also it applies, similarly to my own in journalism. I think there's lots of journalists who would not have been doing healthcare and science before, but now are. And it means they're having to talk to people like yourselves in the expert world. And I would really strongly encourage you to talk to journalists, to reach out to the media in your institutions, in your countries, talk to the press office of the media office of your universities, because that's also a really important way of getting the message out. All of your institutions will have an office for communications, and I think work with them to sort of get those messages out. Yes, sorry.
Okay, sir, thank you so much. I see still we have lots of questions, but since we are running ahead of time, so one last question to just to conclude this. How do you see, we don't know that when the pandemic will end, but how do you see the science communication in post-pandemic era? Sorry.
So, Professor Hina, I think I think this is a really pivotal moment for science communication, both in the pandemic and also after it, because I think as many of the questions have identified, it's moved from a relatively specialist topic, perhaps a niche topic or field, to becoming mainstream. It is part of the mainstream conversation. I mean, just the other day, I was queuing up in my local food shop where I live just to buy some groceries, and we were all socially distanced and waiting to enter because the the manager of the shop, said there were too many people, and he just stopped us. And there were some ladies behind me, and there were some gents behind me, and they were talking about they mentioned the names of the chief scientific advisor to the prime minister, who comes on television every so often to talk about data and vaccines and so on. And he was just on the TV yesterday, and it was just a surreal moment to hear somebody from science communication or science policy being mentioned in a regular shop by just two people. So that just shows you how this relatively specialized topic is now the talk of the world, and I think we should just take that as an opportunity and build on it.
Excellent. With this, sir, I would like to thank you for this excellent discussion, and it is certainly an honor for all of us and a great opportunity to listen you, a person of your stature. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Professor Hina. Thank you, Professor Iqbal, and thank you to everyone for great questions. Really appreciate it.
Okay, you all have a good day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.